He's on the line with us live this morning. Tom Clavin joins us once more. We've had Tom on so very, very often in the past. He's got a new book. It's called The Last Outlaws, The Desperate Final Days of the Dalton Gang. And our conversation brought to you by Marcus & Mack, voted best personal injury law firm in the Best of Indiana County contest. Marcus & Mack, a law firm representing injured people. Tom, I know it's not exactly common for people to call you out of the blue and say, hey, let's go on the radio, but I did that this morning. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for calling.
Hey, the book is wonderful, The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang. And when we think about this group of outlaws, and they really were outlaws, that's a good place to start, isn't it? We have this romantic notion of Old West outlaws like Jesse James and the Youngers, and we think, well, they're modern day or Western day Robin Hoods. Not really. These are dangerous guys.
You know, the press at the time often would paint the James brothers and the Younger brothers as these Robin Hoods, because they did steal from the rich in the sense that they would hold up trains, for example, and the robber baron railroad owners. But they did steal from the rich, but they didn't give to the poor. They gave to themselves, and when they ran out of money, they committed another robbery. So there is a romantic notion about the outlaws, but most of them were not worth those romantic notions.
Yeah, and this was a pretty extensive family with actually a connection to the Younger family.
That's true. Mrs. Dalton, the mother of the 15 Dalton children, her maiden name was Younger. I think it was her brother who was the father of the Younger, the four Younger brothers who rode with the James gang, and unfortunately for them, they all ended up either in prison or dead.
Yeah. Well, these guys on this particular incident that we talk about, and we should tell folks that through the course of the book, you do a wonderful job of sort of painting a picture of the Old West that historians tend to tell us, it wasn't like that all that much. In this case, it was a lot of guys with a lot of guns riding their horses and going from town to town, stopping trains, just like Hollywood has told us all the time. That seems to have been the case with this group.
It certainly was, and that's one of the things that I found enjoyable about working on this book is that as the research I did, I said, there is a lot of the Wild West in this story. It's not fabricated, it's not embellished. This is actually the end of the Wild West. That's one of the things that fascinated me about the Dalton Gang was that they were the last of the real brothers gangs of the Wild West. And once they were gone, so was the Wild West and the way that people knew it at the time.
Did they recognize that way of life was coming to an end?
I think they recognized, yes, they did, because, they were up against increased law enforcement. There were more marshals, there were more sheriffs, there were more police departments, there was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. And they realized, a big reason why they tried to rob two banks at the same time in Coffeyville, Kansas, is they knew that they needed a big score and to get out of the game because they were being closed in on all sides by lawmen.
Well, that's the fulcrum around which this whole book swings is Coffeyville, Kansas. And this was a town that was generally peaceable, so much so that the sheriff didn't even wear a gun. But that is when Bob Dalton dreamt up this idea of robbing two banks in one day. And, well, it turns out that even though they weren't carrying guns at the time, the guns were readily manageable and at hand for the town's defenders. And that's exactly what it turned into, is a big old shootout.
It certainly did, and the hardware stores carried guns. Even if individuals are not carrying guns, once they saw that the banks were being robbed, you need to point out this is way before the FDIC program. If your bank got robbed, you lost your money. There was no appeal to the federal government to get reimbursed. So when the citizens of Coffeyville saw, hey, our banks are being robbed, they ran into the hardware stores and armed themselves with shotguns and rifles and pistols. So when the Daltons tried to escape, they were totally surprised by this angry citizenry saying, we're not going to let you leave with our money.
Now, the Dalton gang that rode into Coffeyville on that day included three Dalton brothers and then some pretty shady characters in that group.
Yeah, there were a couple of guys in there that was sort of like the Dalton brothers, that core group of Emmett, Bob, and Grattan Dalton. They'd have other people would go join the gang. There was another one named Bill Doolin who later teamed up with another Dalton brother, Bill Dalton, on the Doolin-Dalton gang. Some people may recall that early Eagles album, that's Desperado, which is much about the Dalton brothers and that group of Bitter Creek Newman and some of the others who were part of that gang.
Yeah, and so here they come into Coffeyville, Kansas, and the shootout occurs. And Emmett becomes a big part of this entire story and a big source for you for the writing of this book. Emmett Dalton was a really, really fascinating character when you come right down to it, because he was the guy who came back and told the story. He wrote a couple of books about it even.
He did. He was the youngest of the Daltons, and his life sort of spans the very big changes that were going on in America. I mean, he was born in 1871. The Coffeyville event was in 1892. The book opens with him visiting his brother's graves in 1931, after he had spent time in prison, and he, of all things, become a movie producer. And he did write a couple of books about his experiences, which were very, very helpful, because even though not every word in it is true, he has a lot of details and a lot about the relationship between him and his brothers.
Yeah, and a part of what your challenge was in putting this book together is Emmett's not the only one that was writing books about that day, and everybody who did, whether they were participants or folks who were somewhat sideways connected to the Dalton Gang, everyone who wrote a book brought their own perspective to it, and you had to weed through all of that.
Well, that's part of the process of research, where the good news is that there's a lot of sources to draw upon. The bad news is that they contradict each other. So you go with what's consistent, and then with the other stuff, you sort of weigh, okay, what makes more sense? Can we back it up with another source? And sometimes I'm very honest with the reader. I say, listen, I'm not sure. Here's the two different accounts. I don't know which one is exactly true, but I want to offer you both of them so you have this perspective. And I don't want to deceive the reader or mislead them and say, well, I think this is true, so I'm just going to go ahead and print it. That would be irresponsible.
Tom Clavin, our guest. The book is The Last Outlaws, The Desperate Final Days of the Dalton Gang. Now, when you have a gang of desperados like this, there's obviously another side to it, and that is the lawmen who are chasing them. And we're introduced to a whole group of fascinating lawmen. You said that the numbers of folks who enforcing the law back then was growing incrementally in some cases. But there are three in particular, the three guardsmen, as they became to be known, who are just as colorful of characters as the Daltons.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned them, because we have Chris Madsen, Bill Tillman, and then the third one is Heck Thomas, who is, I think, he's definitely one of the main characters of the book, even though the book is about the Dalton Gang, and they're in the title and everything, The Last Outlaws. But Heck Thomas was supposedly the person for whom Rooster Cogburn was modeled after. He was that kind of full-time, tough, rough, track his man down, a deputy U.S. federal marshal. And he was relentless in chasing after the Daltons. And eventually he was the one that got more than arrested. He killed the last Dalton. And to get that perspective, because these guys really sacrificed a lot of their family life, a lot of their health in a lot of ways. Heck Thomas certainly did, because they believed in the law and they believed in tracking down the bad guys.
As we talk with Tom, we only have a couple of moments left. And again, I appreciate so much your being able to come on with me live this morning. There is a character in the book that we need to go back and cycle back to. It's a young lady who might not even have existed, but she's a key part of this as well.
And I mentioned that to the reader. There's a woman named Eugenia Moore, and she was supposedly Bob Dalton's girlfriend, and sort of like a Mata Hari, a spy for them. She would glean information about when payrolls were going to be sent on what trains and what banks might be available for robbing because there's poor security. And she floats in and out of the story, and then at some point she just sort of disappears. And there are some accounts that say that she never even existed, but I think she did, and she's definitely an important character in the book.
Yeah. Wow. Did you do a great job on this? The Last Outlaws, The Desperate Final Days of the Dalton Gang. We were riding down in Texas with the Texas Rangers with you there last spring. And
yes.
And earlier this year, we were in Europe in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge. My goodness, you get around.
I do. I only have that one talent, which is to write. I have no other talents or abilities, so I just stick to the one thing I know how to do.
Now, I know that you also write with your partner Bob Drury from time to time. Are you working on something with him?
We do. We have a book that'll be out next May called Throne of Grace, and it's about the mountain man and explorer Jedediah Smith and his treks across he made 3 journeys across the United States and back in the 1820s and 1830s. So it's about his amazing adventures.
Tom, you have done me a wonderful favor by speaking with me this morning.
Oh, sure. Glad to.
I'm glad that you were available to us and at the last minute like this. The Last Outlaws, The Desperate Final Days of the Dalton Gang. Now, just hit the bookshelves 2 days ago, huh?
It did. It just came out on Tuesday, so it's hot off the press, so to speak.
There you go. Tom, thanks so much for the visit this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS.